All right, so hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is our ORCID US community call on the topic of the National Security Presidential Memo 33. And if you don't know what that is, by the end of this call, you will, so don't worry. So this call is hosted by the ORCID US community, which is a national ORCID consortium for nonprofit organizations in the United States, led by Lyrasis. Lyrasis is the administrative home in partnership with the Big Ten Academic Alliance, the Northeast Research Libraries, and the Greater Western Library Alliance. Just a little bit of logistics. The agenda document, Paolo will link in the chat. If you haven't already seen that, feel free to go in and add your name to the attendees list. Also note that everyone's microphone is muted for now, but towards the end of the call, when we open up for questions and discussion, everyone will be able to unmute, but also feel free to put things in the chat as we go through. This call is being recorded and we will share the slides and recording after. And also you can enable or hide your Zoom auto transcript by using the controls in your Zoom window. Just a little nod to our community call norms. This is our kind of code of conduct. Please just engage in respectful discussions. If you don't understand something, make sure you can ask questions and seek clarification, and just be open and receptive to feedback from others. Introductions. My name is Sheila Rabin. I am the program leader for persistent identifier communities at Lyrasis. That includes our ORCID US community, and also we have a data site consortium as well. My colleague Paolo Guhilde is also on the call. He's our ORCID US community specialist. So Paolo and I work together to provide support for all of our ORCID US community member organizations. And then today we have a featured guest speaker, Lori Schultz from the University of Arizona. Lori has graciously volunteered to speak with all of us from her perspective as the Assistant Vice President for Research Intelligence at the University of Arizona. Lori is also a newly minted ORCID board member and is involved in the Federal Demonstration Partnership. So she has a really unique and awesome perspective that she's going to share with us today. So thank you, Lori. And I believe, whoops. Oh, okay. These are your slides. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Lori. Do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to click through your slides?
I'm fine sharing. That'll be fine.
Okay, so let me stop share and I will let you share.
All right, can everyone see my slides okay?
Yes, looks perfect.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Sheila and Paolo. I'm glad to be here today. And I will start by saying that, I've talked about this topic quite a bit and have more scheduled sessions about this topic over the next few weeks. This particular presentation is more geared towards the librarian and scholarly publishing audience. Whereas if you're interested and want to contact me about more detail on research administration, please feel free to do so. There are a few other opportunities to hear me talk about this if you really want to over the next few weeks, both in person and virtually. But what I really wanted to talk about is, what foreign influence is, how it manifests, and how federal agencies uncover it, particularly on the scholarly publishing side. Basically where they're really concerned is a few really big areas. One is violating the confidential peer review process. That's both in manuscripts and in proposal applications, where information is taken and shared outside of what is expected to be a confidential review process. One other thing is taking intellectual property from the US and filing patents outside the US before entities in the US get a chance to be able to do that. and also appointments or affiliations that duplicate U.S. federal funding and are not disclosed as part of either the publishing and or the proposal application process. And some of the appointments and affiliations also come with money that can be sort of a double dipping relationship. If a U.S. federal agency is about to give a grant in a certain area, one of the things they're reviewing for is whether or not that activity is already being funded by another party. So when those things aren't disclosed, they are not very happy about it. And the way that they uncover these things, especially on the publication side of the house, is using some of the plagiarism review tools that everyone is probably familiar with. The most recent case in the news, you might have heard that the Associate Vice President for Research at the University of North Carolina stepped down over this issue, and that's essentially in this process was discovered. So it's related, even though it's not a foreign influence case. And there are also where they're comparing disclosures and publications with materials that are submitted in the proposal application process. So if you have a manuscript where you say, I was funded by XYZ grant, they're then looking to say, did you say that you had that funding at the time when you submitted an application to the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation or one of the other US federal agencies? So that's how they're uncovering these things. They're basically using publicly available data, their own frankly Scopus subscription, to look through this and figure out where there is not congruency with what is out there in the publishing world versus what is disclosed during the proposal application process for funding. And you've probably seen some of these cases in the news. These are just a few headlines of very recent things that have happened. In Nature, just a few days ago, there was an article about the University of Tennessee professor, Dr. Who was reinstated after being falsely accused of espionage, and the case was dropped. At the very bottom, the case against Dr. Chen at MIT. This case wasn't even a matter of someone breaking the rules. It was actually a misinterpretation of the disclosure rules by the federal agencies when he actually hadn't done anything wrong. And then in the middle, we have a very different case where Dr. Lieber at Harvard was found guilty of concealing affiliations, so paid affiliations, in other words, with the Wuhan University of Technology and participation in a 1,000 Talents program, what are basically known as foreign recruitment programs or foreign talent programs. And where he was caught was more about tax and wire fraud, as well as that double dipping conversation I told you about, meaning the NIH or the NSF or the Department of Energy would not have maybe necessarily made a grant if they had known about the funding he was accepting from these other affiliations. But what is happening, with what had been termed as the China Initiative, which started in 2018, is that the DOJ has renamed the initiative and is stepping away from university research, but that doesn't mean we can take our breaths. And it actually is, we're finding out that all of these requirements that have been in existence since 2018 and have evolved since 2018 are just ramping up and maybe in some ways becoming a little more clear. One would hope anyway. So what we'll sort of be talking about is the NSPM-33 and the activities leading up to it and after it, sort of where we are now, and sort of how that impacts the research enterprise, both the research office and libraries in serving the research mission at any grantee institution. So the NSPM came out in January of 2021, and all of the links to the materials I reference are in the slides. So when you get a copy of those, all those links will be there. And essentially what the NSPM does is directing the OSTP to strengthen protections of US government-supported research and development against foreign government interference and exploitation. So that's sort of the bottom line of where the NSPM comes in. And what it sort of took to get there started in August of 2018. And some of you may have heard or have some familiarity with this timeline if you've heard of the NIH letters. And that's when we say NIH letters in the research office, we all know what we're talking about. And what those really were is that in August of 2018, a bunch of grantee institutions, mostly universities, received letters from the NIH indicating that they had investigated at least 180 scientists at more than 65 institutions for violating policies regarding disclosure and reporting of foreign ties. And that's really when the whole effort to see how this information was disclosed via publishing, conflict of interest, and conflict of commitment processes. That's where we all started really looking at what we were doing and what we thought we were missing. Between May and September of 2019, the Office of Science and Technology Policy launched what we call JCOR, the Joint Committee on Research Environments, and started sending letters around to talk to academic institutions, sort of understand what the conversation was, what concerns were about how information gets disclosed, both in the context of a researcher's employment at their current institution versus what goes into publications versus what goes into proposal applications when they're submitting information about things that are relevant to that funding application that's sitting in front of them. In November of 2019, the National Defense Authorization Act was signed, and this sort of codified all of this review into oversight of foreign influence at the US federal level. And it basically requires national intelligence in the US to report to Congress on this issue. So it went from, a memo from the president's office into these reviews by the OSTP to something that is part of the law we must follow in the US. And then that led to, January 21, the NSPM-33. And in August of 2021, the OSTP asked their working group, JCOR, and the National Science Technology Council to come up with implementation guidance for US federal agencies. And that's where we are today. In January, that implementation guidance came out, and that's where things about disclosure of these kinds of affiliations and other support from other entities, both inside and outside the US, and the use of PIDs, or digital persistent identifiers, which is what the document calls it, has come into play. So that was released in early January of this year. And the deadline for some of the activities inside of that document is 120 days from when that was published. And so I'll go through what that's about in just a few minutes. But Sheila mentioned at the very beginning that I'm involved in the Federal Demonstration Partnership. So I wanted to spend just 1 minute on the organizations that are involved in this conversation that are mostly on the research administration side of the house. So the Federal Demonstration Partnership, or FDP, has a membership that's comprised of US federal agencies that fund research and universities and research centers that receive those grants. And the biggest, the mission of the FDP is for universities, grantees, and federal agencies to work together to reduce administrative burden on researchers. And so that's really its sort of reason for being. The FDP was also the functional lead on Science EV and maintains a foot in that universe, which is going to be very important in this conversation as we move forward. The FDP works with federal agencies on recommendations for managing grants and managing the pieces around grants, both the pre-award application piece and the post-award piece where you're spending the money and reporting out. But unlike some of the other organizations I have listed that are really involved in this space, they don't make recommendations or advocate on behalf of university grantees and researchers, but the other 4 institutions I referenced do. And so the Council on Governmental Relations, or COGR, the AAU, the APLU, and the AAMC are also very involved in this space in terms of working with the OSTP and federal agencies to actually make recommendations and advocate for the good of their member community, which is mostly universities and research centers in the US. So going back to the January 2022 OSTP implementation guidance, so the groups I referenced before are very involved in reviewing this document, providing response and feedback on this document, and depending on what kind of organization they are, recommendations if they're COGR or the APLU, for instance. But the rest of us have really read through it many, many times to try to understand what it means. And I can tell you, if you read a federal document more than 5 times, you start to wonder what words mean, and that's very much where we are all in this space right now. But there are 5 key sections. We are going to focus on ORCID today for the digital persistent identifiers, but I wanted to give you a little bit of context for the other sections and sort of how they in some ways they do all play together. Not entirely, but they are sort of the one big piece, one pie that ORCID's digital persistent identifiers are a part of. So for the context around the first section, disclosure requirements and standardization, What this is really about is in the proposal application process for most federal agencies, there is some version of a biosketch and current and pending or other support. So where you're talking about in your biosketch, things like your organizational affiliations, employment, your positions and appointments, the support you have, the current funding you have, the pending funding you have, and other kinds of support like in kind. Those kinds of things are put inside of these forms during the application process to US federal agencies. And one of the things that has come out of the OSTP guidance is that the federal agencies working together on this are supposed to, within that 120 days, come up with a model application form for this information. What that really means is that there would be one format that would have variances from agency to agency. For those of you who are familiar with NIH versus NSF biosketches, for instance, like the NIH has a personal statement, the NSF has synergistic activities. So there would still be agency by agency differences, but the overall format for static information that stays the same would be the same for the most part. They're hoping for sort of a mix between standardization and harmonization. And the reason we spend a lot of time fussing about those two terms is that for standardization, if we say a current grant is a funding source, or we name it something, then we shouldn't use the term that we name it to describe other kinds of activities. And that's what we mean by standardization. And with harmonization, we're really saying to the agencies, and the agencies are saying to themselves, okay, if we have a different terminology to describe an activity that doesn't fit into, well, when the NIH says this word, it means X. And when the Department of Energy says this word, it means Z. We're really talking about, like, you need to change the term. So there is some clarity on where there are differences agency to agency because of their appropriation, because of their mission. There will be differences because standardization and making everything the same as a whole tends to lead to lowest common denominator, which doesn't make things easier for our researchers. And I'm going to talk more about the DPI conversation after this, but I thought I'd go quickly into the rest of the 5 sections of the OSTP guidance. So it attempts to articulate that there are consequences for violation, although it doesn't really indicate what those might be, just that there could be criminal, civil, or administrative consequences or penalties when a violation is found. Information sharing is about how and when federal agencies would share information about violations between themselves and potentially with law enforcement. And then last but not least, our research security programs. And this is a requirement for programs for cybersecurity, training and research security, export control training, and a bunch of other things that sort of fit under research security. The document itself does not provide guidance, and at least the NSF for one agency has actually issued an RFP to award grants to define research security training and to provide those modules. One of the things that we do know is that the requirement for a research security program will not apply to every grantee, just those that have more than $50 million in federal science and engineering funding. Although I will say, I can tell you $50 million equals $50 million, but we still don't know what that means. We don't know what time period that means, where they're getting that information, and what happens when a grantee organization is close to the 50 million, but then goes over in the middle of that cycle. So there is still a lot that is unknown about what these requirements might mean. So I'm going to take a quick break right here and thank Shauna Sadler, who I know is on this call, for her slides, because I did use some of them. So thank you, Shauna. So in the OSTP document, which the image is on the right here, and there is a link in the slides for the document, there is a very long list of what the federal agencies think a DPI should do and what criteria it should meet. Because US federal agencies have to worry about procurement standards, they never name ORCID specifically, but because of this list, we can all read between the lines and know that they're talking about ORCID when they list all these criteria. So, since most of you are very familiar with the ORCID universe, I am not going to read through all of these, but it does really talk about all the things we know ORCID is. that it's non-proprietary, that it's open, that the researcher controls their record, that ORCID does a lot to discourage duplicate IDs and has a method for resolving duplicate IDs when that does happen, that there is an ability to read and write data from administrative and RIM type systems back and forth, that research agencies like federal agencies can read and write validated information associated with that ID, and that researchers can get an ID with no charge. So they never have to pay to sign up for an ORCID and use it for the length of their career. Sorry, just like not wanting to forward on me. There we go. Most of you already know that ORCID is integrated with the Science CV system. So right now we're Science CV, and I think that this is really the big takeaway for Science CV is that it is what's next when it comes to the OSTP implementation guidance, how federal agencies react to creating that model application form, and how disclosure information can be fed in versus being typed in manually into a Word document and then submitted with a proposal application. So we already know that ORCID is integrated with Science CV, and right now the forms that exist in Science CV are the BioSketch and current and pending support for the National Science Foundation, and the BioSketch for NSF, both for regular research awards and for fellowship awards. And it already works to bring in ORCID information into those formats so that investigators can use Science CV to create a BioSketch or a current and pending support form and do the agency-specific things they need to do with that form. So, enter a personal statement or enter synergistic activities. So those things already exist, and the data model already exists for the idea of this model application form and the way that data could feed from ORCID from the DPI that the OSTP guidance references into this model application form with variances from agency to agency as they work through what that might look like. So as I mentioned, most of you already know that they can do this in Science CV. Where the ORCID ID information for the BioSketch, for instance, maps, as you can see on this table on the right-hand side, in the biography, you can list your personal statement, and Science CV also allows you to enter a personal statement. For employment, you can put position and honors. Education is where you'd list your education and training. Works are your citations and contributions to science. And then Science CV comes back and puts in the parameters around each agency's requirements. So for the NIH, for instance, if you need to elect your top 5 contributions to science, you can basically pick from a list that comes out of ORCID. And then of course, there's the funding where you can list your research support, your grants, and other activities. One of the things that the guidance does is ask that the agencies and ORCID work closely together, well, the DPI provider to work closely together to optimize that data transformation. And it's really becoming more clear that US federal agencies are thinking of Science CV as that solution. So I guess my first thing, and this is my last couple of slides before we turn it over to questions, is to, it's becoming really clear that Science CV is something that they are working on. The data model and the structure to incorporate agency by agency differences already exists and is something that they can consume as they add additional entities. So I've been talking about the NIH and the NSF, but they also use the Department of Education's IES BioSketch form, and they are looking at, prior to this model application form being available and required for application processes, including other agencies who shall remain nameless because I don't think it's public knowledge that they're working on this right now. So the next steps for ORCID is right now ORCID has been working with the NIH and NSF on what kinds of things need to happen to ensure that that some of that data, there are a couple of odd things that US federal agencies want in the application process that wouldn't apply to the rest of the ORCID community. So one of those things is in-kind support, which we can sometimes call cost sharing. And the other thing is the way that we express effort on grants. Grants to federal agencies require researchers to list their effort as person months, not as a percent of effort. And the biggest reason for that is that there's a different way to express person months if you're in an academic appointment versus a summer period versus a fiscal year. And so that's one of the oddities that U.S. federal agencies have in this process that we need to figure out how to do that. And basically, you know, supporting what those changes could be, or those smaller ways of handling these things, particularly for the U.S. community in ORCID, will be really helpful. And I know that the NSF and the NIH are very much looking at how can they directly write information to ORCID records, and we hope the same for other federal agencies. Because one of the pieces of this process is in the proposal application process now, if you have NIH and NSF grants, you're writing them all down again in a form. But if the NIH and NSF already own that data, why aren't they writing it in the form for you as the system of record? But that's just sort of me editorializing just a little bit. So I think, you know, the next step for librarians is really reaching out to the research office and making those introductions if you haven't already. And, you know, collaborating on a plan for Science CV. One of the things about Science CV that is probably not widely known yet, I talked about how the NSF has their biosketch and current and pending support forms in Science CV right now, but they also allow a process for a specific fillable PDF format so that they can still scrape the same data as they get from Science CV from that PDF. The NSF does plan to do away with the fillable PDF format and use Science CV as their solution going forward. For those of you on the call that are familiar with the NSF research administration landscape, the next PAP guide, Proposal Award Procedures and Policies Guide, is likely to remove that requirement. So be on the lookout for that and start preparing for it, because I think if you're not using Science CV right now, you don't have much time before that needs to be integrated and part of the process for NSF applications. And I think there, you know, the other things to consider is talking about options for connecting RIM systems to ORCID for ORCID members that aren't already taking advantage of those opportunities. And, you know, many of the research platforms we already use, like this is probably a conversation with your, you know, not just libraries for the research office, but also for faculty affairs in how some of those systems they use could write to ORCID and may not be right now, because they may not realize that some of that data that they need for these other grant research flows are really relevant to this conversation and could be populated in the ORCID and then into federal grant applications without really much work from the researcher themselves, as long as that technology piece is resolved. And really sort of my last slide before we turn it over to questions is, I think that, you know, for the research office, the research administration side of the house, what they really need is an education about ORCID membership at their institution. You know, how it's being used today, whether or not your institution is using any of the API keys and how, whether or not you're using the affiliation manager and what options that provides for you know, universities to write trusted data to the ORCID record, which is very relevant to the pieces of the proposal application process that are being reviewed for disclosures. And then resources for getting researchers in ORCID, like who has one on campus and what can we do to grow that number. And I think this is a place where I know this group thinks about that quite a lot, but I think this is about to explode the universe. So when it comes to who has an ORCID on my campus, how do we get all of them to have an ORCID? And so any of the resources that have already been created and posted to the Lyrasis site and other places, I think are going to be really valuable in getting libraries, research offices, and faculty affairs on board with having more ORCID use in the, you know, in the coming future for how this impacts grant flows. And I think that there are other things that are maybe not as time sensitive as the disclosure process and the DPI process that affects research security and the NSPM-33 and the subsequent OSTP guidance. But I think once research administrators realize what DPIs, PIDs, ORCIDs can do, they will have a great understanding of how it impacts many of the things they were already thinking about, but haven't quite made the connection. You know, the biggest one, of course, data management and sharing, with the NIH policy becoming effective in January, NASA writing their own proposed data management and software sharing policy very recently, which just closed for comment. I think research offices having an understanding of how that workflow works, you know, having an ORCID, having DOIs for publications and data sets and other outputs of work, and how you can actually demonstrate compliance for a publication or a data set that is in your campus repository by using PIDs. I think that is a universe that they're not quite aware of, but really need to understand as they figure out how we're going to comply with data management policies, how that's going to work going forward, including our own goals for open access and even, public access policies in general, even when we're not talking about data sharing policies that have been revised by federal agencies. And for grants and other research resources, I know that, there's a lot of exciting activity in Crossref, in the ROR. Somebody like a VPR needs to understand how an ROR works, how things like research resources being articulated in the ORCID profile can demonstrate for them how people are using their core facilities in a way that they've never uncovered before, as one example. So there are a lot of ways that I think that the PID education process is only beginning, starting with the one that is for a person, and then sort of getting into them understanding how these things all tie together and can be represented in an ORCID profile for data use across their institution that is more than just proposal applications, more than just compliance with data management policies, but also can uncover insights on other parts of research on their campus. And with that, I will stop and take as many questions as you have for me. I wanted to have a lot of time for questions, as especially since I'm talking about this a lot, and I wanted to hear what folks are concerned about. I will stop sharing.
Awesome, thanks, Lori. Okay, I am. Okay, so if you have a question or a thought, a contribution to the discussion, feel free to unmute. You can also turn your video on. You can also post things into the chat and we can monitor that as well.
Yeah, and I saw Jason's chat just now about how, it is a lot easier if PIDs become more of that process and more consistently with the DOI metadata. Yes, absolutely. I think that, the OSTP guidance doesn't go so far as to require a PID of a researcher, but what I think is going to happen is that the grant processes where they need that information will be much more difficult without one. So it's sort of demonstrating that having one makes your whole life a whole lot easier.
Great. Okay, Matthew, I see you have your hand up, and then we also have another question in the chat. So we'll go Matthew and then Kristen.
So I was curious whether ORCID is investigating the, so we talk, with ORCID, we're talking about you making assertions about yourself in your profile, right? But I was wondering if ORCID is looking at the notion of attestations that people would make about you. For instance, verification that you are employed at a university, that you have a certain citizenship, that you've completed a certain training, and that kind of external verification, as opposed to you saying something about yourself in a profile that may or may not be valid.
Well, I know, and I will ask Shauna and others from ORCID who are here to correct me where I'm wrong or misstate things. In terms like the federal agencies in particular, love the idea of trusted organizations being able to write that kind of information, particularly employment kind of information, or like even publications that might get written to the record by publishers. They like that, and in some ways they want to be a trusted provider of information, especially around grant and contract type information. I think there are other pieces that are a little more challenging even for universities to populate, like citizenship, and that's only because our data is not always complete. That's like less, we all know how that works on our campuses for the most part. It's not always the best information. And I would ask, Shauna, if you have anything you'd like to add there, please do.
Sure, thanks, Lori. So Matthew, great question, I really appreciate it. So with ORCID, what we do is we provide ORCID IDs to researchers for free, which is great, especially we're trying to be a global community and across all subject areas. So we have tremendous uptake in the global south, which is really great. But what we do to sustain ourselves as an organization is to have a membership fee for organizations like universities, publishers, research funding agencies. And so with that membership, all those organizations can do, just like you said, to write the validated, accurate information to the ORCID records of their affiliated researchers. So Lori mentioned RIM systems, research information management systems. like Pure, Symplectic Elements, Esploro, and such. So all those systems manage the data about your researchers at your campus, and then you can activate with ORCID membership writing to all of your researchers. So you're a researcher in this department, your start and end date, or the education. So you're a grad student, it's probably a really good idea for some of the Ivy Leagues to write to the education section. So when people say, I have this fantastic degree, it's a nice open way to verify that. And we're working with lots of funding agencies to write funds to ORCID records, and associations, so professional associations for memberships. When researchers are part of the American Chemical Society or different professional, they can show that on their ORCID records. So it's really great for universities, especially with this audience, to make sure they know which research information management system there is being used at their campus. And then when they have ORCID membership, to turn on the ORCID ability to write, and Sheila's available and Paola's available to give you a hand with all those details. Did I miss anything?
Thank you. That's perfect.
Great, thanks y'all. Okay, I'm just gonna go down in the order of the chat to the different questions that are here. The next question is, with all of this convergence happening, will more institutions require ORCID or ORCID IDs? How many do now? I can start with that because we work with at least all of the institutions that are ORCID members in the US. I don't have a specific number because it's really hard to kind of keep track. I know there are a handful of, for example, universities that require certain faculty to have ORCID IDs. For example, like all the faculty in the medical school need to have an ORCID ID or something like that. But in most cases, it's really more of just encouraging, strongly encouraging, rather than requiring people. And that's kind of from the university perspective. You're probably familiar with publishers already often requiring ORCID IDs from people when they submit manuscripts, and then funders are increasingly requiring ORCID IDs when people apply for funding, or just asking and making it optional. So I don't know if Lori, you have any other kind of insight on that, or maybe even Shauna or somebody else on the call want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think you're right on. I think strongly encouraged is really where a lot of schools are. Although if there's anyone in the room who requires one, I'd love to know about it and how you did that. I think what's likely is that for my institution, the way we'd look at it is devoting the resources to getting people set up to make it easy, to make them, provide the value to them so they understand why they're doing it. But also, I think where we would stand on the requirement is how that gets shared back to the trusted organization, so the member organization. Yeah. For us, that's, having the ORCID is great, but sharing the information back with us is even better.
And just quickly to add on to what Lori said, recommended is usually preferred, or is usually adopted by universities and funding agencies. But when your university wants to commit and try to encourage adoption of ORCID IDs, it is really important to make sure the executive are on board and part of that policy requirement and that communication. When the provost, the president says, it's important that you do this, and especially if it's included in some of the regular systems like your annual report or your tenure application system, it really does help with researchers and their adoption. And as Lori said, help demonstrate the value of ORCID and how it actually does make their lives easier. And it improves the quality of data that's reused in the whole research ecosystem.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question is, how does the DPI conversation cover ghost ORCID profiles and other difficulties in user coverage across the USG funder awardee space? Any thoughts on that?
I will take the second part of the question first. So by user coverage, do they mean not, grantees that are maybe not necessarily higher ed or research organizations, like maybe smaller grantees that don't have a traditional academic career path. Is that what they mean by coverage? Or
I'm seeing grantees who don't have ORCID IDs and might still need a DPI to give to the funder.
okay, so I can answer that question right now. The OSTP guidance doesn't anticipate a place where federal agencies in the US will require a DPI at any stage in the process. There just would be different workflows for people who had them and didn't have them. And I think that the concept is that the workflows for people who have them would be simpler, but it wouldn't be impossible if someone didn't have a DPI and chose never to get one.
Great, thanks, Lori. The next question is, could you elaborate on the concept of how ORCID could help with tracking the use of cores?
Yeah, and I think Zach was answering in the comments there a little bit.
Okay.
The way I see it, so a core or other basically research resource asset. So there's something called an RID, the Research Resource Identifier, which is basically a PID for research resources. So you can assign those to cell lines, organisms, core facilities, like an instrument in one of your core facilities, and the use of that resource can be added to an ORCID record. So there is a way, would be a way to uncover, if you were the owner of that research resource, how it was being used. Like one example I can use from my own universe is we do a lot of space missions. So if we assign an RID to an infrared camera that is currently in space and people are using time on that camera, it would be a way to figure out who in the world was using that camera if it was all tied to their ORCID records.
That's right. And I'm just showing, this is just one example. I have other examples, but this is somebody's ORCID record, and they have an entry in the research resources section from ORCID. So basically, a lot of national labs are starting to use this. This is kind of a relatively new feature on ORCID, where a member organization of ORCID can actually add this type of information to somebody's ORCID record to like track usage of facilities or equipment, labs, even library collections if you wanted to do that. So we can put more information about the ORCID research resources in the chat as well. Okay, let's see. I am falling behind here in the chat. So the next question, an employer writing to employees' profiles has to be permitted by each individual researcher, right? A university can't mass update everyone's ORCID. Yeah, that's correct. So you have to have basically an ORCID API integration, and then your researchers have to go and connect their ORCID ID with that integration. And when they do that, they're basically authorizing permission for the organization to update their ORCID record. So that is correct. You could do a mass update if all of those people had authorized that permission. And of course, Paolo and I can provide more information about how those integrations and authorizations work. Okay, so great. Rebecca Bryant has shared that OCLC Research published a report last fall that describes the research information management ecosystem in the US with case studies. And so there's the report. So that will definitely be something that everyone should look at. Seeing just some comments here. Let's see. Another question, do or will individual scholars have an ability to override what is written to their profile by an institutional ORCID member? So for example, if a researcher is working on a politically sensitive or controversial topic that may bias reviewers, given the NSPM's roots in national security, ORCID will enable national scholar profiles, and scholar control may become vital to scholarly freedom in changing national political winds. So yes, individuals have full control over their ORCID record. So if something is added to their ORCID record by an organization and that individual either doesn't want that on their ORCID record or doesn't want anybody to see that, there are visibility settings. So there's a default visibility setting. So if you are working on sensitive things, you could just set your default to private so that no one can see it. And then you can go in and make certain items public or trusted parties only if you just wanted to share those items with trusted organizations. So yeah, and the individual can also delete entries that are added from an organization altogether if they just don't want that on their ORCID record at all. Okay, let's see. So curating individual ORCID profiles can be extremely time consuming, especially when cleaning upstream information. How many groups here are supporting individual faculty with the metadata in their ORCID profiles? Is it being handled via the library or research IT or research office or IT? Anybody want to speak to that? I know I can say a little bit just from the overarching community that we've worked with. A lot of times it is people in the library so far that are really helping individual faculty, especially to kind of curate the data on their ORCID record or get data added to their ORCID record. I know some folks on this call have developed custom integrations to kind of help that process and let faculty claim works. Like publications is, I think, one of the biggest areas. Does anyone want to speak to that? Lori, do you have any insight, or anyone else on the call?
Yeah, for me, this is a question that's kind of maps to Shauna's question about how we're preparing.
Right.
Is figuring out what we need to do that, and we haven't even started that yet. And for folks who are from the U of A who are on this call, I recognize a couple of names. Please feel free to contact me. We're definitely in the process of the first phase for us is really with the OSTP guidance, since there is a bunch of information about a researcher that would need to be disclosed in a varying number of ways. So we're sort of talking about proposal applications and how, you know, ORCID information can populate that space. But a lot of times that data lives in siloed places at a university, like in their conflict of information system, in the HR system, and in other places. So we're looking at sort of inventorying what we know to be true about where we think the guidance is headed. And so we're, you know, inventorying what we feel like we have in place and we have partially in place. And sort of the next step is going to be figuring out how do we roll out, you know, more usage of ORCID. We do have a number of people who do use ORCID on our campus, but it has more relationship with faculty activity reporting and other activities than it has with the research side of the house to date. So we just need to bring those things together.
Great, thanks, Lori. Any other questions or comments? Feel free to unmute as well as posting in chat. Okay, we got another one. Because this effort is tied to national security, do any of you have concerns regarding researcher or faculty backlash? Anyone?
I think that's a really good question. And I would love to hear it, even if folks wanted to contact me offline about what some of those issues are. Yeah, because in the organizations that I refer to as the FDP, COGR, and others, that those groups can really be helpful in getting that kind of feedback back to the agencies about, you know, what are the concerns around. There are definitely concerns around privacy, like that's always going to be a concern. But you know, concerns about, well, now I have to get this new ID that I didn't know I needed. Even though it's not listed as a requirement, it will be read as a requirement. So I think that there will be concerns.
Yeah, I think, you know, there are, you know, certain people out there that just have concerns about their privacy. And I think a lot of it comes down to just the outreach and education aspect. So making sure that your researchers understand that they can make information on their ORCID record private if they don't want to share it. I mean, they're not going to be able to populate their Science CV bio sketch with their data from ORCID if that data is set to private. So it's not really going to benefit them as much. But if they do have, you know, deep concerns about their information and sharing it, that's one thing to communicate. Also, it's helpful to know that a lot of the information on an ORCID record can probably be found on the web somewhere, you know, publicly already. It's just that the ORCID record is giving you the ability to bring all of your information together into one place and save you time when you're going and filling out grant applications and doing reporting and stuff like that. So I think there might be some continued misunderstandings about how ORCID works and the type of information that you can store in an ORCID record and the visibility settings, but the more kind of researcher outreach that we can do to make sure everybody understands how this works to mitigate their concerns will be helpful. And that's something that Paolo and I are going to continue to do, is our ORCID workshop for researchers throughout the year, and we'll let everybody know when we do those, so you can send your researchers to us if you're not doing your own ORCID outreach. Any other questions? Let's see. Okay. Okay, so Lori, great, you shared your email address in the chat, but do you have information on your other upcoming talks?
Yeah, so next week, this coming week, actually, on Thursday, I will be at the Ankara PRA conference talking about other support and ORCIDs in this context. That's mostly a research administration audience. Shauna and Chris Shillum and I will be presenting to the Federal Demonstration Partnership on the 24th. That's mostly about DPIs for research administrators. So that's sort of more explaining the nuts and bolts of how they work to a research administration audience in the context of the OSTB guidance.
Will any of those talks be recorded and or can other people participate?
Yeah, I can, I can get the registration information for the FDP one to Sheila, and that will be recorded and viewable by anyone. Like, it'll just be online. You don't have to be a member. But the NCURL one is an in-person conference, so it won't be recorded.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then let's see. I think there was another question, which was, our research information management system can write to ORCID for publications and works, but will this memo also want to add to ORCID things like funding, employment, education?
And I think, it's in the proposal application process, the data is required. How it gets populated into those forms is really up to how you want to do this. I think that if you're able to, it can make your researcher's life easier, because one of the things, if the U.S. federal agencies write funding information to the ORCID records, so NSF grants or NASA grants or whoever else, that is only one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of a researcher's funding profile is going to be a lot of things that aren't necessarily written automatically by anyone, unless the grantee, you do it. So it's really a conversation to have about whether or not you'd want to do that. They have to submit the information anyway, so it's just deciding how it's going to populate that record.
Great, thanks, Lori. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of kind of back and forth questions about, is there documentation about how to use ORCID with Science CV? I know a lot of universities have created their own local documentation, so thanks to those who have shared that. We also have a blog post and a tutorial video from the ORCID US community. So when we send out the recording and the slides, we will include all of these kind of helpful links and things so that everyone can have those as well as the chat log. Any kind of, I know we have about 5 minutes left. Are there any kind of last minute questions or comments?
Sheila, maybe I'll just jump in real quick and just say that, right now, today, we're just kind of giving everybody a heads up that these changes are coming, and that, all of us, like Lori, we're working so closely with the NSF and NIH to get the specific details. And so we're really hoping to be able to circle back to this community. Hopefully I'm aiming for, sometime between September and December with specifics. So we can say exactly, clear expectations that from NIH and NSF and the ideal best practices for how to populate and what should be in an ORCID record. We don't have that yet. But so today is just so to make sure that everyone's aware, and hopefully we'll have another session in the fall or winter with some details for everybody.
Yeah, and I think maybe the only other thing I would add, I put my email in the chat again, and for anyone who has feedback about Science CV and the way that it can evolve and be enhanced as these changes happen, please feel free to send them my way.
Perfect. Thanks, Lori. And thanks again, Lori, so much for your presentation. I think it was super helpful. Thank you for everyone who has attended today, for spending your time with us. Thanks for all the great questions and comments. We also put our email address up for the ORCID US community. So, feel free to contact Lori, but also feel free to contact me and Paolo, especially if you have any very ORCID specific questions. And then we're also on Twitter at US Consortium. So thanks again, everyone. Please stay tuned for the recording slides, and we'll have kind of the Q&A and helpful links as well via email after the session today. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.